Disclaimer. The following broadcast gives a true and honest account of the events described, and all evidence and details herein are solely factual. What you are about to hear is real and may disturb you. Caution is strongly advised. Welcome to Dead Souls Social Club.
If you find our show interesting and you'd like to support us, please consider heading over to ko-fi.com/Dead Souls. That's ko-fi.com/Dead Souls and donating to our research and investigations. If Instagram is more your thing, you can find us there by searching Dead Souls Podcast and we'll come up. And on one final note, we'll soon be relaunching our Patreon page, so if you'd like to subscribe to our research monthly, you can do so, and we'll keep you up to date with some sweet rewards in return. Keep checking our socials or future episodes, and we'll let you know when that goes live. As always, thank you for joining us. This is Notorious, Episode 2, The Grey Man. This is the second episode in our true crime series. I wanted to get this episode in early because, well, I'll be frank, it's quite shocking and outright foul. Whilst all of our true crime episodes are arguably very unsettling, this is by far the worst in my opinion. So much so that I've recruited some help in speaking about certain aspects, as I didn't even want to read them on air. That said, I'm not going to sugarcoat the events portrayed in this episode, neither will I water down the reality of what occurred. After all, what would be the point? But before we proceed, can I please provide you with a strong warning? This episode contains descriptions of violence, torture, cannibalism, and extreme methods of murder. And what's worse, it involves children. Listener discretion could not be more strongly advised in this instance. That said, let's go. The Grey Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wisteria. Serial killer, rapist, cannibal, and child molester Albert Fish was known by a number of chilling monikers, but none of them could portray him chilling enough in ways that evoked the reality of his horrific crimes. His inhumanity hardly seems believable. How can a man, a human being, be so cruel? Albert Fish was much more than the crimes that he committed, however. Small, quiet, and unassuming, he had a face that blended in with the crowd. He looked like a friendly and gentle old man, a grandfather sort. His private life, however, would have frightened even the most hardened criminals. Born Hamilton Howard Fish on May the 19th, 1870 in Washington, D.C., just 5 years after the end of the U.S. Civil War, Fish was the youngest of 4 children. His father, Randall, was 75 years old when Fish was born, some 43 years older than his mother, Ellen. As a child, Fish was plagued and surrounded by mental illness. Not only was his brother in an asylum, but his uncle had suffered with religious mania, and his sister Annie was diagnosed with both mental affliction and hydrocephalus. Fish's mother routinely experienced visual hallucinations too. Fish's father was a fertilizer manufacturer by trade and an ex-riverboat captain, and in October 1875 he suffered a fatal heart attack at a railroad station in Baltimore. Fish was just 5 years old at the time of his father's death, and being the sole breadwinner in the family, his mother struggled to look after her 4 children alone. Fish's mother then put her son into St. John's Orphanage in Washington at just 5 years of age. Whilst Albert hailed from a family who struggled with the difficulties of mental illness, much can be argued for St. John's, moulding Albert's behaviours in later life too. The monster lying dormant within him was about to be awakened. Fish was a resident of St. John's Orphanage for 4 years. During his stay, the other boys would tease and ridicule him and call him Ham and Eggs, a play on his name Hamilton. Fish hated this so much that he eventually changed his name to Albert. It was the name of an older brother of his who had died several years before. Albert was severely abused at the orphanage, both physically and sexually, by the staff as part of what they called shame punishment, but also by the other boys who were resident there. Fish claimed that the staff would demand the boys strip to their underwear and stand in a line, where they would be beaten and whipped on a daily occurrence. Albert actually developed a like for the pain, and grew to enjoy the beatings and sexual abuse. The physical pain of the beatings, coinciding with the sexual abuse, affected Albert's thought processes, and as he put it, something flipped in his brain. The abuse gave him enormous sexual pleasure, and he would get erections midway through a beating, which would bring ridicule and further torment from the older boys. Seeing the other boys being abused only turned Albert on more. He said of his time in the orphanage that it is what turned his soul dark, although I think there's argument for creation as well as development in terms of his psychological state. When Albert was 9, his mother secured a job and took her children back into her own care. Albert came home with a bedwetting habit and a macabre interest in bodily fluids, clearly as a reaction to severe psychological trauma. Albert wouldn't be able to stop bedwetting for more than 3 years after he had left the orphanage. Albert's mother was elated that he had changed his name to Albert, and she made it legal on his behalf. She said that it was like Hamilton was gone instead, and she had her dead son Albert back in a strange play of events. By now, Albert's sexual desires were increasing and getting out of hand too, particularly with the arrival of puberty. He would often frequent bathhouses so he could see naked boys and men. At age 12, Albert began a homosexual relationship with a telegraph boy. The boy introduced him to a range of depraved practices, including urolangia, or drinking of each other's urine, and coprophagia, or eating each other's feces. They would push their perverse sexual needs and desires to the limits, which triggered a unique appetite in Albert. Around this time, Albert fell from a cherry tree and suffered a serious concussion. This would result in constant headaches, dizzy spells, and a pronounced stutter that would remain throughout his lifetime. In 1890, Albert moved to New York City with his mother. He would later tell the police that he became a male prostitute at this time, but kept it secret from his mum. This would also give him partial outlet for his extreme desires, as he would allow his customers to use his body however they pleased. He also began raping young boys around this time, he told police, regularly molesting younger children, preferring those who were under the age of 6, he would state. Albert started working as a painter and a wallpaper hanger throughout the 1890s in an attempt at normalcy and legitimacy. But he also enjoyed writing obscene and bizarre letters to women who had placed personal ads in the newspapers as a strange interest. In 1898, Albert's mother arranged for him to marry a 19-year-old girl by the name of Anna Mary Hoffman. She was 9 years Albert's junior. They would have 6 children together. Even though Albert treated children in horrific ways, he was said to be a fantastic father who doted on his own children, although they did note a few strange behaviours from him, but we'll return to his children later. At the same time of his marriage, Albert would maintain sexual relationships with a string of male lovers, as well as abusing young children. Now, trigger warning, Albert said of this period of his life that he would often choose children off the street who you thought no one would care about or miss, like black boys or boys with learning difficulties or disabilities. One of his regular male lovers took him to a waxwork museum where Albert became fascinated by a model of a dissected human penis at the time. It was this experience that further developed Albert to have a fascination with genital mutilation and castration. This guy's really collecting the full set, huh? Anyway, for the rest of Albert's life, he would insert needles into his scrotum, penis, and abdomen in order to achieve sexual satisfaction through pain. He also routinely flogged himself with a nail-studded paddle. In 1903, Albert was arrested for embezzlement and packed up to Sing Sing prison in New York State. During his incarceration, Albert regularly engaged in sex with other male inmates, and his psyche took a turn into an even deeper spiral, if that's possible. He would regularly hear voices, and he claimed that he was receiving messages from John the Apostle. On one occasion, his oldest son, Albert Jr., saw him standing on a hillside with his arms outstretched, and he was screaming, "I am the Christ." He was convinced that he was being directed by God to castrate little boys. Psychiatrists would later diagnose him with a condition known as religious mania, a condition an uncle of Albert's also suffered with before him. The children would also recall seeing their father flagellating himself on the back with his nail-studded paddle, a favourite form of pain that he enjoyed. Albert Fish had always had a sick urge to torture, kill, and eat his victims, and his urge for cannibalism was growing inside of him, and every day he came that little bit closer to making it a reality. In 1910, Fish began a sexual relationship with a 19-year-old intellectually disabled man by the name of Thomas Kedden. Fish was working away from home in Wilmington, Delaware, and the two men engaged in sadomasochistic sexual acts. Due to Kedden's disability, there is some debate about whether he consented to these acts or was unable to. Regardless, Albert took full advantage. Kedden was a well-built boy and had a pretty face, almost androgynous, and he looked younger than his 19 years. Around 16 or so, people who knew him would say. Over a period of 10 days, the acts that Albert carried out on Kedden became more and more like torture, with Albert inflicting extreme pain. Albert later said, while being interviewed by law enforcement, that he met Kedden while on his way to Wilmington. He picked him up after Kedden told him that he had been raped on multiple occasions by hobos and tramps while on his way to Wilmington. It's thought that Albert may have exaggerated this story in order to justify his actions with Kedden, however. He took the boy into his rooming house initially with the intention of killing the boy and dissecting his body, but slowly over a 10-day period, just to maximize the thrill. When Albert got him into the room, he noticed that Kedden was crawling with lice. Kedden was apparently scratching like mad, so Albert made him strip and gathered up his lice-riddled clothing and threw them out. Then he ran a warm bath and told Kedden to lay flat in the bath until he returned from the drugstore. Albert returned with hair remover and clippers. He removed Kedden's long hair and then mixed up the remaining hair remover into a paste and smeared it all over Kedden's body. When he was finished, Kedden was completely smooth and hairless. And then, as Albert puts it, the fun began. In the statement that Albert Fish later made to authorities, he described the sex in graphic and disgusting detail. It's a bit difficult repeating it here, but trust me when I say it was by no means normal sex. But in short, and to maintain thorough transparency, they took turns playing the roles of naughty boy and disciplinarian father, and whoever was playing the father would spank the one who was playing the naughty boy role. Additionally, the spankings were so rough and severe that they would each mess themselves and subsequently eat each other's feces from each other's anuses. They described their body parts as dicky honeypot and sugar bowl. I'll leave it up to your imagination to figure out what body parts those would refer to. As I previously mentioned, this went on for 10 days, and Albert's sadistic cravings were insatiable. Albert wanted to hear Kedden scream though. He wanted to cut him, to slash his flesh and watch him bleed. He wanted to burn him and whip him, but he couldn't do it where he was staying in his rooming house. There would be too much noise. People would hear, he thought. So, Albert looked around for an abandoned building and eventually came across an old farmhouse. In the farmhouse there was a room with a bed, chair and a door with a lock. Everything that Albert needed, he thought. After they both arrived at the farmhouse, he made Kedden once again strip naked and then locked him in the room and left him alone overnight. When Albert returned the next day, he had with him a sharp knife, box of matches and some alcohol. Albert also filled a bucket with ice-cold water from a well outside the farmhouse. The water was for Kedden to drink, but he gave him no food. Albert wanted to restrict Kedden's energy, but keep him alive, and the water and no food combo would be sufficient for this, he thought. Young Kedden must remain weak. Bizarrely, after all they had been through over the last 10 days, Albert still had Kedden's full trust. Albert tied Kedden's hands and feet. He whispered in Kedden's ear, "I have you exactly where I want you." Albert pushed Kedden over onto his stomach. Albert whipped Kedden with barbed branches from a blackberry bush, and with every blow, Kedden's flesh would tear and bleed. Albert would drag the brambles through the skin, ripping chunks of flesh from his behind. Kedden screamed, and Albert felt the rush he had been craving. There was no one around for miles. No one could hear the screams or agonized pleas to stop. Blood poured out of Kedden's back and lower behind. Albert smacked it with his bare hand, which caused blood to spray over the walls and in his face. Albert slashed at Kedden's ass cheeks and sucked the blood from his wounds, biting the wounds so that the blood would squirt into his mouth. Albert then left Kedden naked, bleeding and mutilated on the floor for the night, locking him in the farmhouse so he couldn't escape. Albert didn't return until the next evening after he had finished work for the day. He brought candles. How romantic. The candles, though, were because Albert thought it would be kinky to torture Kedden by candlelight. And so it went on for 5 more days. Relentless torture, pain, screaming, blood. On the 6th day, Albert allowed Kedden to eat and brought him a sandwich. But Kedden had to eat his feces first before he was allowed the sandwich. Albert Fish still wasn't done with Kedden, though. Albert strapped Kedden's legs to the head of the bed over his head, with his behind in the air, leaving him in a very painful and vulnerable position. Albert then pushed a whole pack of needles into Kedden's behind. Albert joked that Kedden looked like a pincushion. He then stuck a needle through the head of Kedden's penis, and then stuck another needle between his testicles and left him in that position with his legs over his head and with needles protruding from him. Albert wouldn't remove the needles or release Kedden from the painful position he was in until the next morning. When he did pull the needles out, he sadistically poured peroxide over the bleeding wounds. Kedden's penis turned a dark blue due to the blood loss. Albert eventually untied Kedden's feet, and an exhausted Thomas Kedden just fell asleep right there, drained of all energy and any will to go on. But Albert wasn't happy with this, and rest wasn't something that he was prepared to allow, and he stuck a needle deep in Kedden's belly to wake him back up. He then, sadistically, fed him a tablespoon of food, made him eat his own feces once again, and continued whipping, cutting, and burning him. Now, according to Albert, after a short period of time, they both started to enjoy eating each other's feces and drinking each other's urine. They referred to their shit as peanut butter and urine as cider. This came from Albert, bear in mind. The torture went on in a repetitive fashion, almost as if Albert had run dry of depravity and couldn't push the boundaries any further. Human waste was used in a lot more disgustingly graphic ways, and Albert even allowed Kedden to punish him in return using similar torture tactics. Albert knew he would have to return home, as it had been around 5 or 6 weeks since he left and people were going to start wondering where he was, he thought. Strangely, in a display of Stockholm Syndrome, one would presume, Kedden didn't want Albert to leave. He had become accustomed to the torture. Albert had a grown desire to kill Kedden and eat him, though. He kept his thoughts from the boy, but they bubbled under the surface the entire time that Albert was with him. He tied up Thomas Kedden and took a blade, slicing off half of Thomas's penis, reveling with sexual ecstasy as the boy screamed the most blood-curdling sound. Blood was now gushing from Kedden's penis like a fountain, and Albert really wanted to finish off Kedden and slice off cuts of his flesh to take them home to eat, like select cuts of meat from a butcher shop. But the weather was very hot that day, and Albert knew the smell would draw significant attention on his journey back home. Albert proudly emailed law enforcement later on and told them that the expression on Kedden's face when he cut off his penis shocked and thrilled him, but it shocked him to the point that he stopped short of killing him. Instead, he poured peroxide on the open wound and wrapped it with Vaseline and a cotton handkerchief. He untied the boy and gave him some clothes, $10, and kissed him goodbye. It's unknown what became of Thomas Kedden, although without urgent medical care, he would have surely bled to death soon enough. In 1917, Fish's wife left him for another man. She left him with 6 children to raise on his own, according to Fish, and she also took almost all of the family's possessions that they owned. It was from this point, and likely as a result of the marriage collapse and situation that Albert found himself in, that his paranoia took an entirely new dimension. His children came home to find him wrapped up in a carpet, and he would encourage them to hit him across his bare buttocks with his nail-studded paddle, so that he could endure pain and feel less numb. However, all of his children would say on record that their father never physically or sexually abused them, and they all maintained that he was a good father. It was around this time that Albert's mental state declined even further, and he began experimenting with cannibalism. He started eating raw meat, which he would also serve to his own children, and then this soon escalated to human flesh, thus intensifying his criminal activities. He needed to kill young boys to feed his need for human flesh, and he did so in and around the Washington, D.C. area. He got away with this by choosing children that he thought law enforcement wouldn't be interested in searching for. He was correct and targeted mainly black and Hispanic boys at this time. Fish developed the skill of luring children away by offering them gifts and appealing to be exceedingly kind and flattering towards them. He came across as a gentle old grandfather. In July 1924, Fish came across a young girl who was playing alone on her parents' Staten Island farm. He convinced the girl to go off with him to pick rhubarb, but the young girl's mother felt uneasy about the man talking with her daughter, and she scared Fish off. Still, his obsession with the 8-year-old girl forced him to return, and he tried to sleep in the barn. He was discovered in the barn, this time by the young girl's father, and he was once again chased away from the property. Another botched abduction occurred when he invited 2 young boys into his apartment for lunch. The boys waited in his bedroom while Albert prepared the food. They began play wrestling on the bed, then falling onto the floor in the process. It was then that they saw what was under his bed. Lurking in the darkness lay Albert's instruments of hell, a meat cleaver, a hacksaw, and a knife, all bloodstained. Frightened by what they saw, the 2 boys took to their heels and ran fast, escaping past Fish and out the door. Fish's next criminal endeavour threw his modus operandi into chaos when he unwittingly abducted and murdered Francis MacDonald, the son of a Staten Island police officer. The boy was from a white, upper-middle-class family and would surely be missed. The 8-year-old was playing ball on the street with 4 friends when Fish, who had been hanging around for hours watching, called the boy over. Fish acted swiftly, and MacDonald's 4 friends neither saw what happened to the strange man nor where their friend had gone. When young Francis failed to return home, his father set out to look for him. After scouring the neighbourhood and questioning the other boys, he kept hearing about the grey-haired man who had been hanging around watching the boys play. Based on this information, he telegraphed police headquarters. The following day, a massive search began throughout Staten Island. Eventually, the search party would find the body of Francis MacDonald, specifically 3 Boy Scouts who had been searching under a pile of branches and leaves on a rural property. All of Francis's clothing below his waist had been pulled from him. It was clear that he had been viciously sexually assaulted. His body was fissured, and the killer had finished him off by strangling him with his own suspenders, which were wound so tightly that they initially appeared to be part of the boy's flesh. Over 50 police officers descended upon the body. The case was immediately given the highest priority within the police department, and some 250 police officers were assigned to the case. The boy's father, Arthur MacDonald, was transferred from Manhattan to Staten Island so that he could personally work on his son's case, something that today would constitute a conflict of professional interest. The autopsy of Francis's body revealed that he had been eating raisins just prior to his death. The police concluded that this must have been the way, or ploy, that the killer used to tempt the boy away. The horrific condition of the body caused the coroner to conclude that the attacker could not have been an elderly man like the boys had described. There was no way an older man could cause that degree of physical damage, the coroner stated. The killer must have been in his prime, fit, healthy, and strong. Mass hysteria swept through the state, and daily reports were broadcast of sightings of what the media called the Grey Man. In the weeks following the discovery of young Francis's body, dozens of men were questioned, with several being arrested, though later released. Hopes for an early resolution to the case had all but vanished, as the leads dried up, however. As the case faded in the public eye, the dead boy's mother made a desperate plea to the public to help catch the monster who killed her baby boy. "Help us find the Grey Man," she begged. Here's something you might find interesting. About a week after Francis had disappeared, a 17-year-old girl was walking through the woods alone when she noticed an old gentleman who was scruffy looking. He had grey hair and a grey beard, wearing blue trousers and a soiled white shirt. He was crouched over in the long grass, and he seemed to be eating something out of his hands. The location was very close to where the body of young Francis was discovered. Now, if it was Albert Fish, the girl said whatever it was that he was eating, he was grasping it in both hands in an animalistic fashion, and she said he looked wild, ravenous. Terrified, she turned and ran through the woods to her home. Mrs. MacDonald was certain the killer was the old grey man who tipped her hat to her on the street, and not a younger, fitter man. On the day of her son's funeral, little Francis lay in an open coffin with makeup that had been thickly applied to cover up his battered face. There was hope that the killer would come to the funeral, but no suspicious men turned up. Days turned into months, months into years, and the killer seemed to have escaped justice. 3 years later, on February 11th, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney would disappear from outside his apartment block. Billy was last seen in the hallway of his family's apartment in Brooklyn, New York, playing with two neighborhood boys, one 3 years old and the other 12 years old. The 12-year-old boy went into his apartment, and when he returned, both boys were gone. The 3-year-old was found sitting on top of the roof and said that Billy was taken by a bogeyman. The hunt for the Gaffney boy and the bogeyman who took him was intense, with over 350 policemen, not including neighbours and members of the public, joining in the search. Now, in a very cruel twist, a constant flow of cruel letters were received by the parents of Billy Gaffney. These letters range from sympathy to cruel descriptions of what had happened to their son. Some stated he had been killed, some said that he was now living with a new family, and other letters claimed Billy was being experimented on or tortured. The mind of the general public back then was as crazy and cold as it is in today's society. Some people actually sent detailed maps through the post so that the Gaffney family could follow the map and find their son's corpse. But of course there was no corpse. They were just further sick hoaxes. The police, on the other hand, had absolute zero to go on. The case became messy and everyone became a suspect. Family members, even Billy's own father, became a suspect. This is partly due to the desperation of Billy's mother, who became that desperate and hysterical that she had started accusing everybody of taking her son, pointing the finger at his own father. The police, wanting to appear to be doing something, but with no clues in their ineptitude, simply investigated every accusation that Billy's mother threw out. Billy Gaffney had simply vanished into thin air. There was eventually one solid lead, but it took quite a few years for everyone to even realize it. A trolley car conductor named Anthony Byrne came forward claiming on the day of Billy's abduction at around 7 p.m, an elderly man with a grey mustache and beard boarded his trolley car just 2 blocks away from the Gaffney apartment. The old man was pulling a little boy on board with him. The boy was wearing blue shorts and a grey t-shirt. It was bitterly cold and the boy had no coat and no hat. Tears streamed down the child's face and he seemed resistant of the old man. The conductor claimed that during the journey, the young child cried constantly, whilst the nervous, fidgety old man tried in vain to calm him, even wrapping him in his dirty long coat as he nervously mangled the boy off the car. He asked the driver if it was possible to get a ferry to Staten Island nearby. The driver gave him directions, and then the old man went on his way, completely ignoring what the driver had said. The last thing the driver saw was the old man, half dragging, half carrying the frightened little boy who cried constantly down the street until the shadows of the night engulfed them both. Albert Fish was never officially charged with the murder of Billy Gaffney, although later, while in prison, he was asked if he took the boy and he stated that he did. Further, he went on to describe in writing for the authorities what he did with the boy. Now, warning, the following letter that Albert Fish wrote is extremely graphic, and regarding a 4-year-old boy, you might want to skip ahead on this one. Fish's prison letter to authorities read as follows.
I brought him to the Riker Avenue dumps. There is a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the boy there, stripped him naked and tied his hands and feet and gagged him with a piece of dirty rag that I picked out of the dump. Then I burned his clothes. I threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back and took the trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked home from there. The next day at about 2 p.m., I took tools, a good heavy cat o' nine tails, homemade, short handle. I cut one of my belts in half, slit these halves into 6 strips each about 8 inches long. I whipped his bear behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, then slit his mouth from ear to ear. I gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. I picked up 4 old potato sacks and gathered a pile of stones. Then I cut him up. I had a grip with me. I put his nose, ears, and a few slices of his belly in the grip. Then I cut him through the middle of his body, just below the belly button, then through his legs about 2 inches below his behind. I put this in my grip with a lot of paper. I cut off the head, feet, arms, hands, and the legs below the knee. This I put in sacks weighed with stones, tied the ends, and threw them into the pools of slimy water you will see all along the road going to North Beach. I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body, which I liked best, his monkey and peewee, and a nice little fat behind to roast in the oven and eat. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, pieces of his face and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt and pepper. It was good. Then I split the cheeks of his behind open, cut off his monkey and peewee, and washed them first. I put strips of bacon on each cheek of his behind and put them in the oven. Then I picked 4 onions, and when the meat had roasted about a half hour, I poured about a pint of water over it for gravy and put in the onions. At frequent intervals, I basted his behind with a wooden spoon, so the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours, it was nice and brown, cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet fat little behind did. I ate every bit of the meat in about 4 days. His little monkey was as sweet as a nut, but his peewee I could not chew. I threw them in the toilet.
On May the 20th, 1928, 18-year-old Edward Budd placed a one-line classified advertisement in the New York World newspaper in an attempt to find employment. Just 3 days later, an elderly man knocked on the front door of the apartment on 15th Street in Manhattan where Budd lived. He said his name was Frank Howard, and he was calling in regards to the ad in the paper. Budd's mother invited him in and sent his younger sister Beatrice to fetch her brother from next door. Edward turned up with his friend William in tow, who was also looking for work. Howard offered both boys jobs on his farm in Farmingdale, Long Island, almost right away. He told them he would return on Saturday and drive the boys to the farm. That Saturday arrived, and the boys waited excitedly with their bags packed. But Mr. Howard never turned up. A telegraph was delivered instead, which told the boys that Howard had been delayed and would come for the boys the next day. When he eventually turned up in the early afternoon on Sunday, the family had just returned from church. In a show of hospitality, he was invited to stay for lunch, and he happily accepted. It was while sitting at the dinner table that Mr. Howard got his first view of young Grace, a pretty 8-year-old girl who was dressed in her best Sunday clothes. The old man was immediately smitten with her, beckoning Grace over to him. She looked at her mother reluctantly, but who nodded in her assent. Mr. Howard told Grace how pretty she was. He then asked if she was a good counter. When she nodded, he pulled from his pocket the biggest sum of money that anyone in the room had ever seen. He laid his cash on the table and asked Grace to count it for him. $92.50. At the conclusion, Mr. Howard rewarded her with a 50-cent coin and told her to go and buy some candy with it. The little girl left the room happy. After all, 50 cents back then was considered a generous sum for a young child, worth almost $10 today. It was then that the old man informed the boys that there had been a slight change of plan. He had to attend his young niece's birthday party that afternoon, but he would return for the boys that evening. Just as he was leaving, he turned to Mr. Budd and said that he just had a thought. Would they allow him to take young Grace to the birthday party with him? He said it was going to be good fun. There's going to be lots of food and games and plenty of children Grace's age, and of course, the old man would have her back by 9 o'clock. Mrs. Budd was at first very hesitant, After all, they didn't even know this man, although he did seem extremely kind and he clearly loved children. Before she could answer, her husband had made up her mind for her though. He said that the girl never got out and it would be good for her to have some fun with other children for a change. Mrs. Budd wanted to know where the party was going to be, and Mr. Howard told her that it was at his sister's home at 137 Columbus Avenue. What the Budds didn't realise was that Columbus Avenue ended at number 100 at 10th Street, so the address did not exist. Young Grace Budd was dressed up in a spring coat and grey hat with blue streamers, and with Frank Howard she headed off up the street. Mrs. Budd stood at the door and waved as she watched them disappear around the corner. It would be the last time that she ever saw her daughter. The Budds waited with growing anticipation and alarm for Mr. Howard to return with Grace. By Monday morning, Mrs. Budd was hysterical with worry. Edward was sent to the nearest police station to report that the girl was missing, abducted. A short time later, 4 detectives arrived at the Budd home to question the family. It was immediately big news across the country. The case was unique in that the whole Budd family had got a long and detailed look at the so-called Mr. Howard. Thousands of flyers were printed with a detailed description along with a photograph of young Grace. These were distributed throughout the United States and Canada. But as expected, there were a rash of false sightings and leads that went nowhere. But then a solid lead finally emerged. The telegraph office where Howard had sent the telegraph to the Budds was identified, and an intensive search of that area then turned up another clue. A food basket that Howard had left at the Budds' house was identified, and the man who had sold it to Howard was tracked down. It was deduced that the kidnapper was a resident of East Harlem, although any lead from there went cold. Despite a raft of letters and confessions coming in to law enforcement, nothing would pan out. But then, in September 1930, there was a break in the case. Police arrested a 66-year-old by the name of Charles Edward Pope. Pope was held in custody for 3.5 months and then put on trial only to be found not guilty. In November 1934, the still grieving parents of Grace Budd received an excruciatingly gruesome letter, which police later confirmed was from Albert Fish. Another trigger warning here. The letter read,
My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma. His name was Captain John Davis. The ship sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong in China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned to the dock, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out, and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and is sold as veal cutlets, brings the highest price. John stayed there so long that he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York City, he stole 2 boys, one 7 and one 11. He took them to his home, stripped them naked, and tied them up in a closet, and then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy, because he had the fattest ass, and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except the head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, and stewed. The little boy was next, and he went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street. He told me so often how good human flesh was, and I made up my mind to taste it. On June 3, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street and brought you pot cheese and strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in the closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take the meat to my room, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though I could have if I wished. She died a virgin.
The police were able to compare the handwriting in the letter to the telegraph that was sent to the Budds years before. The envelope in which it was contained, well, printed on the back of the envelope flap, were the initials PCBA, a clumsy error by Fish. Police were able to track it down to the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. They found out that a janitor at the association had taken a bunch of envelopes home to his rooming house at 622 Lexington Avenue. Detectives descended on the boarding house, but were frustrated that no one there matched the description they were given of Mr. Howard. The police thought it turned out to be another dead end, but then the janitor remembered that when he had taken the envelopes, he had not yet moved to Lexington Avenue. He had still been living at East 52nd Street. When a detective visited the address at East 52nd Street and showed the landlady the description of Mr. Howard, she immediately recognized him as the elderly man who had moved in when the janitor had left. The officer asked to see the man's signature in the register, and pulling out the letter that had been sent to Mrs. Budd, he could see that the signature was written by the same person who wrote the letter to the Budds. The man had signed his name as Albert H. Fish. The detective discovered from the landlady that Albert Fish had moved out a few days earlier, but received regular support checks from his son at the address. On several occasions, he had asked the landlady to cash the checks on his behalf. It just so happens that the check was due any day, and Fish had said that he would return to the residence for it. The police now set up a 24-hour surveillance of the boarding house. On December the 4th, the landlady of the rooming house contacted the police and informed them that Fish had appeared at the rooming house to collect his check. When the detectives arrived at the boarding house, Fish was sat with the landlady drinking tea. Albert Fish was put on trial for the murder of Grace Budd on March the 11th, 1935. The night before Albert Fish appeared in the courtroom, Fish had managed to extract a chicken bone from the soup that he had been served in the jailhouse. He had sharpened it to a point and repeatedly stabbed himself with it in a meek attempt at suicide. When a guard heard him moaning, he rushed in and managed to take the makeshift weapon away from him. During the 10-day trial, Fish maintained an indifferent attitude. He sat slumped in his chair, often with his eyes closed, and appeared to show absolutely no interest in the court proceedings or evidence against him. One reporter described him as resembling a corpse. It was the contention of the defense that Albert Fish was legally insane at the time of the killing, and remained so as he was sat in front of them. The prosecution, on the other hand, set out to prove that the opposite. They stated that he knew the wrongness of what he was doing, and therefore he must answer for his actions. The prosecution called a series of psychiatrists as witnesses, each of whom stated that the defendant was seen to be suffering from a whole host of psychotic conditions. The prosecution submitted X-rays of Fish's pelvis and perineum during the trial, which showed more than 24 thick needles embedded within Fish, so he could continually feel pain. In the end, the prosecution managed to persuade the jury that Fish was entirely sane and thus responsible for his atrocious actions. The jury of his peers found Albert Fish guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence was execution by means of the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. Upon being sentenced, Fish turned to the guard and simply said, "It will be the supreme thrill, the only one I haven't had." One of the jurors later revealed that most of the jurors actually felt that Fish was insane, but they felt more strongly that he was deserving of the electric chair. Albert Fish's last day on earth was January the 16th, 1936. He was 65 years old. He was escorted into the execution chamber at 11:06 p.m. His last words were, I don't even know why I'm here. Fish clasped his hands together in prayer as he was lowered into the chair and strapped in. The leather cap was also fitted and electrodes were attached to his skin. He actually helped the guards attach the straps and electrodes himself. As the command to throw the switch was given and the current surged through his body, Albert Fish jolted backwards and his veins in his neck bulged as his fists involuntarily clenched. Fish then went limp. The monster was no more. There is much to be said for Albert Fish. Yes, he was sick, depraved, and mentally ill, but he was only given the macabre mental tools to a certain degree at birth. Much of his sadistic habits and questionably evil needs can also be attributed to his time in St. Joseph's Catholic Orphanage too, and the mental scarring his 4 years there left him with. I have left a link in the episode notes to a very in-depth report into the practices at this specific orphanage at the time of Albert Fish's residence. It's an interesting yet disturbing dive into what went on there and how their practices contributed to the beast that Albert Fish turned into, and it's a fantastic supporting read for this episode. I'd like to give all credit to Christine Keneally for that article and all of her research.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our show tonight. Be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform and subscribe to our show so that you never miss an episode. Our shows aren't sponsored by any company or corporation, so any support you can give us goes a long way in supporting the work that we do. Visit deathcult.com for more information on how you can help us and support our broadcasts. There you can also find links to our socials, Patreon, and episodes. From all of us here at Dead Souls, sleep tight.